Oi, oi, all right. How's it going? I'm Grant. You're you. This is the Doodle Review. Today, we're doing a top 10 of alternative albums that are celebrating their 20th anniversary. These are 10 albums from under the broad tent of alternative music that released 2 decades ago now, back in '05. And this was kind of an interesting period of time. Business wise, the music industry still hadn't really gotten their head around the internet and piracy. They were still trying to fight it rather than embrace it. iTunes was making them feel like they had a handle on the situation, and ultimately that just gave cover for torrent services like Pirate Bay and Oink to thrive behind the scenes. Politically speaking, the US and UK were ensconced in the Iraq-Afghanistan war. The disillusion toward Western governments on this issue kind of hangs over the music in this period like a cloud of unrest. Sometimes it's called out explicitly, other times it's more subtle, but it's undoubtedly a characteristic of the era. And at a genre level, you're starting to see the post-Strokes NYC influence peter out a little in the US, giving rise to more alternative abstractions of the scene, while in the UK, we're just starting to see the green shoots of the second indie wave that would come to dominate the back half of the decade over here. As for me, I was 13, and at this point, getting a little bit of a semblance of music, starting to go a little deeper, but my full immersion into becoming like a fully sentient and obsessive music consumer was about a year or so away. So most of the albums in this list I came to retrospectively. That's almost it for the preamble. Just a few quick notes before we kick off. I review newer albums every week in my email newsletter, and a link to subscribe is in the description. Subscribe to this YouTube channel for things like deep dives, lists, and interviews, and check out the playlist link below if you want to give like any of these artists a try. All right, let's give it a go. Let's bang into these 10 albums. Starting things off with a band that have nothing to do with the political or genre movements I just described. The Giraffes released their self-titled fourth record in 2005, an album I've consistently found myself revisiting since discovering it in like '06, '07. The Giraffes, on this album at least, are like a fusion of the dangerous but virtuosic elements of Guns N' Roses in their Appetite era and the rough and ready garage punk of the Hives or Rocket from the Crypt. Frontman Aaron Lazard doesn't have the upper register of the '80s Sunset Strip glam bands, but what he lacks there, he makes up for in showmanship and chaos. I think the legend was that this singer had had like 3 heart attacks before this record dropped, just due to the sheer rock and roll fuckery present in his lifestyle. And that might seem irrelevant, but I honestly think it translates to the whole vibe of this LP. The guitars of Damien Paris are absolutely searing hot, and if you give a track like Wage Earner a listen, you should immediately get where I pulled that GNR comparison from. Junior at his worst is probably my favorite on the whole record. I think it's emblematic of what this band did really well, which is to offer that whole like rock and roll chaos, baby, but like do it in a way that isn't cringe. This band had the grit, the edge, and the credentials and genuine danger to pull it off without falling into parody. And there's very few bands out there doing this right now. So if that sounds like your cup of tea, I'd give this one a look. There are a few examples in 2005 of established bands going back to basics, simplifying, maybe even dumbing down their sound in order to pull them through a period of hardship. Of note, you have With Teeth by Nine Inch Nails, a record that aided in Trent Reznor's recovery from addiction by focusing less on high concept and minute detail and more on just basic hooks, as a result delivering his biggest chart success and creating a huge comeback. You also have Queens of the Stone Age returning from the high-profile departure of Nick Oliveri with a sound that revisits the dark repetition of their debut. Then you have Garbage, who triumphed over surgeries, writer's block, in-band fighting, and a near-complete breakup with Bleed Like Me, an album focused on accessible hits over alternative deep cuts. I actually think, Queen's Lullabies to Paralyze is probably the best of these 3 records, as it managed to both reach backwards and chart a path forwards compared to some of the others. But I wanted to talk about Garbage because, I talk about Queens all the time, and I think Bleed Like Me is a really cool album. Now, I don't remember the songs of this record cutting through to me as more of a mainstream general rock consumer back in 2005, which was before my music fixation kicked in. But revisiting this over the years, I'm genuinely surprised by that. Sex is the Enemy, Run Baby Run, Right Between the Eyes, Why Do You Love Me? They're all super catchy slices of alternative rock. It's easier to list, in fact, the tracks that kind of don't immediately have you humming along. by the time they finished. And really, I think it's all over but the Crying and Metal Heart are maybe the only ones. And perhaps it is, as I say, more the simplistic approach that didn't captivate people in the way that the breakthrough singles like Queer, Only Happy When It Rains, or Stupid Girl did with their kind of like underlying weirdness. Why Do You Love Me, for instance, for all its catchiness, feels a little stock, a little like the band on autopilot, particularly that intro riff that feels very basic and tacked on, and the chorus hook is kind of an open goal. But while you can critique the album for some slightly more by the numbers arrangements, I don't think you can say this record doesn't bang. This really is an all killer, no filler album with 9 out of the 11 tracks so fun and so easy to enjoy if you're an alternate rock lover. I particularly love the cathartic hooks of the melancholy Run Baby Run, which has a Pumpkins 1979 feel to it, and Right Between the Eyes, even if like that high filtered intro kind of makes you think that Kelly Clarkson's about to come on. So I got two stories about this album that really show my age. The first is that I initially got turned on to Block Party via the soundtrack of the amazing Burnout Revenge on PS2. And man, I wish I still had a console so I could give that a blast every now and again. Helicopter was featured on that soundtrack. And really, I don't know what better song there is to smash supercars together with. The second story that totally carbon dates me is that off the back of loving Helicopter, I got a copy of this album by borrowing it from my local library, ripping it and burning it to a CDR. Something that I was doing on a weekly basis at this time, filling folders and folders with burned CDs that became part of my musical education. A few short months later, I'd have one of those USB MP3 players with about 150 megabytes of space. And just thinking about that now is like hitting me like a wave of nostalgia. But millennial memories aside, this album is amazing. Block Party obviously get categorized with the whole UK indie scene, but aside from the grainy, scratchy guitars and stiff delivery, they were actually pretty unique. For me, what really makes this album, beyond the, amazing guitar weaving, riffs and catchy hooks, is the drums. Matt Tong's performance on this record is astounding. The pace and energy is incredible, and it delivers non-stop propulsion throughout, even through the sensitive moments. Tong is an expressive, creative drummer, but his busy parts fit beautifully and don't distract. I think of the bridge on This Modern Love with those constant rumbling rolls along the toms. It's a soft moment in the song, and going hard behind it could potentially ruin that, but Tong approaches the part in such a way it becomes just like the perfect complement. You've also got to shout out the fantastic drum sound achieved by Paul Epworth and engineer Elliot James. The drums sound bombastic, sometimes distorted, sometimes gritty, but never overbearing. Okay, let's now mix it up with something that definitely breaches the alternative label and feels a bit more mainstream. As much as I love to talk up underground records that aren't mentioned often, I have to be real that Gorillaz' Demon Days was one of the best records of 2005, even if it's pretty well known by the culture at large at this point. Gorillaz, for the most part, is a project defined by collaboration, and part of the project's charm is the jukebox variety you get with every record. Demon Days, though, is the exception to that rule. It's an album that, while certainly not lacking guests, De La Soul, MF Doom, Ike Turner, Shawn Ryder, among others, all feature, it feels very much born of a singular vision. Each song connects to the other using a similar palette of icy horror synths, cushioning strings, and scratchy indie guitar, with each track looking at these ingredients through a carnival mirror that can reflect back hip-hop, dub, electronica, or even disco, and somehow make it all work. To me, while the Gorillaz catalogue has many high points, Demon Days is the most consistently compelling, cohesive, and 20 years on, doesn't feel in any way dated compared to some of their records that I think wear their errors very much on their sleeve. At number 6, I wanted to include the first album from one of my all-time favourite bands that I just don't hear talked about enough, Deer Hunter. The unfortunate title of the record, if you're wondering, supposedly is named after the heckles that they'd received from like rowdy audiences in their earliest days. Deer Hunter, if you don't know them, are, depending on like what era you drop in on their catalogue, they're an indie garage rock, a post-punk, psychedelic, ambient, or art rock project. I've never been into Animal Collective, but I think they would be the closest, more like mainstream-ish band you could kind of liken them to, except Deer Hunter, led by the enigmatic Bradford Cox, has always had the cooler, darker, punkier edge because they just didn't give a fuck. The band has generally two accepted classic records, 2008's Micro Castle and 2010's Halcyon Digest, but this 2005 record is where it all started. They had in fact been a project for a number of years prior to this, but it took a while for the band's material to emerge from what were initially more kind of like freeform tendencies. This is definitely apparent when you listen to the record for the first time. It was the last one I came to from these guys, primarily because it's not on streaming anywhere. You have to dig it out on YouTube. The band definitely slowed down, got more delicate and melodic across their later albums. So to put Turn It Up on after getting accustomed to that feels a bit like if you've ever fallen asleep with your earphones in and then somehow managed to lean on the volume button and jolt yourself awake with like a blast of sound. After a few spins, you start to be able to lock into the songs buried under the static, though. And there are eerie tracks like Basement with its classic Deer Hunter arpeggio guitars, gathering pace as delayed looping noises cycle and cycle into oblivion. Tech School showcases their Wire and Gang of Four Love with these agitated interweaving guitars. And Young Leia demonstrates their art school weirdness with what sound like a barrage of detuned recorders over the top of trancey krautrock. It's easy to see this record as like completely disconnected from the broader musical trends or genre movements of the mid 2000s. But actually, what struck me when I revisited the album is how many moments there are where the drums are doing this like offbeat, open hi-hat indie disco thing. And it's behind crazy shit you wouldn't actually hear at a disco. But I find it interesting that some of what was happening in the broader culture was somehow finding its way into the music here. This is a challenging but no doubt great debut. I hope it gets a reissue or a broader release. I also just hope we hear from Deer Hunter again, full stop, because man, it's been too long. It's Men's Needs, Women's Needs, whatever, the Cribs' third album from 2007 that has always reigned as the band's most popular. And because of that, I've always felt 2005's New Fellas kind of doesn't ever seem to get the recognition it deserves. Among a small circle of my friends, we decided about like 15 years ago that the Cribs were like our band and have seen them live at almost every opportunity we could. As a result, I've seen these three Wakefield brothers perform more times than a number of bands I'd probably consider like slightly more important to me. And I bring that up because, again, Men's Needs gets the broader recognition, but almost three-quarters of this album are absolute staples in the band's live set, even to this day. When the songs we're talking about are Mirror Kissers and Hey Scenesters, it completely makes sense why. The energy of these tracks, the singable guitar hooks, the gang vocal, what, if you had these tracks in your arsenal, there's no way that you wouldn't play them at every opportunity. The thing I've always loved about this band is the collision of a very UK laddie type humor combined with a sensitive arty sensibility. Ryan Jarman has this kind of effeminate quality to his voice and mannerisms. They have the whole Kurt Cobain outcast loner music nerd thing to them, but also have this football chant from the stands laddie demeanor. The two things work quite well together, I think. The down-to-earth boys on the beer vibe makes them accessible, while the sensitivity stops that from ever being toxic. It also leads to amazing lyrics like, take drugs, don't eat, have contempt for those you meet. I love this band, and I think this album's quality. To my mind, We Are Scientists were a band that were vastly underrated amidst the tidal wave of indie in the mid-aughts. Their visual style, demeanor, and even band name came off as light-hearted. They were funny. They didn't take themselves seriously. And perhaps that ultimately worked against them in a scene where you either needed to be like Interpol serious, or if you were enjoying yourself, it needed to be under the cover of being like dangerous, messy, and self-destructive. You either had to be bummed out or your fun had to be in service of channeling some sort of inner angst. The British wave of indie slightly shifted things in that regard, but the Scientists were undoubtedly an American band. Perhaps that's why they kind of slipped through the cracks a little, or at least didn't or don't get the recognition today that I think they should. The irony is that for all of the band's outward enjoyment and taking the piss, With Love and Squalor is a serious record bearing all the hallmarks of the scene. You've got Can't Lose, a moody slow burn about changing one's personality to desperately meet the expectations of a not so interested partner, self-pity and self-destruction on callbacks, and getting strung along by a situationship on inaction. There are great lyrics, great choruses, great hooks, and great riffs. Among the moody downbeat moments or among the offbeat indie disco hi-hats, the three-piece demonstrate an almost classic rock appreciation for a big fucking riff. The descending breakdown at the end of Inaction, the immediately recognizable guitar crawl at the end or at the start of Nobody Move, Nobody Get Hurt, or the undeniable banger that is The Great Escape. This album to me literally has everything and is a firm favorite I come back to a lot. Over now to a singular artist and her debut that 20 years on still feels ahead of its time. I feel like Carla gets a lot of the praise in MIA's discography that should go to Aralula, because this album, although maybe not attempting to cover as much ground, is way more enjoyable to me. When I listen to this LP, I'm reminded of how Iggy Pop would say he used to model his lyrics around like nursery rhymes or kids' TV shows, using as few words as possible and striving for ultimate word economy. Although worlds apart musically, there's a playful but deep and clearly punk spirit I think these artists share, and that really clicked for me with Aralula. Bucky Dungun sums up everything I love about the record. It feels lo-fi but lush, the bounce and instrumentation is vibrant, and while the song's co-produced and co-written with the then unknown American dance producer Diplo and incorporates Brazilian Bali funk, the song, and by extension the album, evokes for me the city of London on its best days, with all of these cultures coming together to build something better. This is an album that breezes past, and even the skits, which is like a phenomenon of 90s to 2000s music I generally fucking hate and find annoying, which was starting to die out then, even here these kind of bang a little bit. I think this is a classic and an incredible debut. This is one of the most unique albums in this list and one of the most unique records, full stop. After tumultuous and turbulent years of faux breakups and partial continuations, post-punk icons Gang of Four reunited in their original lineup for a brief tour of about 6 months from 2004 to 2005. And in that time, the band hit the studio. Although rather than recording new material, they decided to re-record 14 existing tracks. And while that seems weird and maybe it was a bummer for fans, the crackling energy that ripples through this album is actually insane. The guitars are janky and vicious as hell, the tempos are fast, and the recordings are loud, aggressive, and crisp. Something that some of these tracks didn't receive in their very earliest presentation. The album comprises of cuts predominantly from their debut Entertainment and sophomore record Solid Gold, but does include a few lesser known tracks as well. It flows like an album with care put into the sequence, and the almost frustrated delivery of a band that had played these songs on and off for 20 years only enhances the tension of these post-punk arrangements. And it's such a unique concept for an album. I'd be so curious to hear other artists have a go at it too, which is a weird one because if you hear of your favorite artist like going into the studio, you wouldn't necessarily want them to squander the potential for new music. But at the same time, I wouldn't be mad if like Nine Inch Nails delivered a studio album that captures the live arrangements of their earliest tunes, which have changed so much, or if, I don't know, Converge wanted to revisit some of their earliest hard to find recordings. What's fun about this album is that it was released, you know, in the heyday of like LCD Sound System and new rave, indie rave and all that. And while Gang of Four's punk credentials sometimes prevent them from being referenced as the obvious source, if you listen to this, it's unmistakable. This is where that sound came from. You can't find this release on streaming, but for anyone wanting to get into Gang of Four, I would highly recommend this as a starting point. You can find it on YouTube. So when I put this list together, there was really only one album I was going to put at number one, and it was this. The criminally underappreciated album Capture, released from the criminally underappreciated band, The Rakes. The Rakes perfectly combined angular post-punk guitars, upbeat indie hooks, and white-collar working-class lyricism to deliver an amazing debut record and one of the best of this whole era. The track list is stacked with absolute bangers from front to back. Of course, the most well-known tune from the band would be 22 Grand Job, which may have ultimately been a double-edged sword in the years following the album, as it became slightly intertwined with the term indie landfill after, you know, every tit with a guitar mod haircut, tight blazers, and V-neck shirt had a pop at being in a band. But in the context of this whole album, alongside tales of one-night stands, saving for a holiday, being overdrawn, rowdy mates, and getting mugged, the salary-themed track fits and kind of feels honest. It's also the most casual reminder of like the state of the UK that 20 years on, a 22 grand job won't have probably increased that much compared to the cost of living and property, which is easily 5 times, but this isn't that type of channel. Alan Donahoe's lyrics demonstrate self-awareness of the questionable lad nightlife behavior described, but 2005 was a long time before artists felt compelled to distance themselves from what we now call toxic behavior. As a result, the lyrics to me still get to be an effective spotlight on how kind of not to behave without bashing you over the head with it. And more importantly, from that non-judgy vantage point, the lyrics can actually be funny. Musically, this fits perfectly within the 2005 era of gritty indie rock, but it's not without surprises. Binary Love is a brilliant mid-album highlight that gates its guitars into becoming completely robotic, a backdrop to a rare moment of sensitivity, while Violent uses delay and rim shots to switch gears into a dub kind of style. It also contains my favorite lyric, referencing an after the club mugging when the protagonist actually has nothing to give. We'll take your jeans or lack of money. We'll take your jeans or lack of money. All right, that's 10 albums, so it's time to knock it on the head. As usual, this is just my opinion, which means sweet diddly. So let me know what records you'd have in this list in the comments. Get new album reviews in your inbox by signing up to the newsletter in the description. While you're down there, check out some other videos that you might like. And, you know, if you can be asked to do all that, subscribe, stick around, share some thoughts, show some love, or just hold some abuse in the comments. Other than that, there you go. Take care, mate. Cheers. Bye.